House of the Dragon focuses on roughly a third of the material George R.R. Martin wrote for Fire and Blood, an in-universe history of the most famous fictional family associated with dragons. Despite that, there's so much lore stuff in those pages that an entire 4-season TV series has been made about it. And if you're like us and can't wait for the finale to find out what happens at the end, then we've got great news for you. After watching this video, you won't need to. Spoiler warning for those who want to follow the TV series, because today we're going to cover the entire history of House of the Dragon, from the books, beginning to end. So without further ado, let's get right to it. The succession crisis of the century, the complicated web of oaths, marriages, and familial relationships in House Targaryen. The stage for the House of the Dragon was set in such a way that civil war was inevitable. It was just a question of when it broke out rather than if. The entire reason this series exists is because of the succession crisis within House Targaryen. Succession crises would plague the Targaryens throughout their reign, but this one was arguably the biggest because it came right after an era of unprecedented peace and prosperity. Jaehaerys Targaryen ruled the Seven Kingdoms for 50 years after inheriting a kingdom that had been torn asunder by a decade of civil wars. And in that time, he stabilized both his realm and his succession. He and Alysanne had the most number of legitimate children out of any Targaryen royal couple, with 13 children including stillbirths and those lost in infancy or childhood. But in an attempt to reverse his predecessor's issue of not being able to conceive an heir, Jaehaerys kind of overdid it. As the saying goes, too many dragons in one house is as dangerous as too few. From the beginning, Jaehaerys and Alysanne disagreed on the concept of male primogeniture, with Jaehaerys' stance being staunchly for, while Alysanne's being staunchly against. This came to a head at least thrice in their lives. Their first time was when the second of their first 3 children lived long enough to be proclaimed heir, but Jaehaerys didn't do it because she was a girl. Instead, he named his 3rd child and first surviving son, Aemon, his heir, and told Alysanne that his actual eldest, Daenerys, would rule the kingdoms by becoming his queen. That didn't happen because Daenerys died shortly after, and Aemon ended up marrying Jocelyn Baratheon. He only had one child with his wife, and that was Princess Rhaenys, aka the queen who never was. So that once again conflicted with Jaehaerys' ideology. At this point, we think it's pertinent to talk about all the relationships that the old king had built with the great houses through his children's marriages. His eldest, Aemon, bound House Baratheon to the Iron Throne by marriage, while his second son, Balon, took his second daughter and 5th overall child, Alyssa, to wife. Both of Jaehaerys' children after Alyssa went childless. Maegelle became a septa and Vaegon became an archmaester. Princess Daela Targaryen was married to Lord Roderick Arryn and gave birth to Aemma Arryn, Rhaenyra's mother. And the rest of Jaehaerys' children either died tragically or didn't have true-born children. The Old King and the Good Queen's youngest 3, Gaemon, Valerian, and Gale, all died shortly after their births. Their most beautiful daughter, Visera, was promised to Theomore Manderly, whose great-great-grandson, Torrhen, is part of the show. But she died during a drunken horse race, ending that alliance. And Sarah, Jaehaerys' most controversial child, had several children in Lys and Volantis, including one by a Triarch, but she never returned to court or called herself his daughter ever again. So, houses Baratheon and Arryn were bound to the Targaryens by blood and marriage, and House Valerian would be added to that when Rhaenys married the Sea Snake. The Valerians had a long history of intermarriage with the Targaryens, and at the time, they were the second house of Westeros, its great naval power and its wealthiest family. So having 3 of the 9 greatest houses in the Seven Kingdoms connected to the Targaryens strengthened their political alliances. However, it also created the possibility of the throne passing to another great house, however minuscule it could be. And that's the exact problem Jaehaerys had to resolve, in addition to male primogeniture, by calling a great council. For decades, the realm felt secure because his heir and spare were going strong. Aemon had only one daughter, but he and Jocelyn were still young and could one day conceive a son. Balon and Alyssa had 2 healthy boys, Viserys and Daemon. And Daemon in particular was such a skilled warrior that Jaehaerys gave him Dark Sister personally. We bring up the possibility of Aemon having a son because of Jaehaerys' preference for male primogeniture, and it's that preference that eventually triggers the crisis. Aemon dies before having any other child, and that means that the throne must pass to his only surviving heir, Rhaenys. The princess was pregnant with her first child, her son Laenor Valerian, when Aemon died. If the throne passed to her, then her heir would be a Valerian, and House Targaryen would be displaced. And moreover, naming Rhaenys as his heir would also make Jaehaerys' lords rebellious, because male inheritance has long been the custom in Westeros. He controversially passed over Rhaenys to name Balon, now his eldest son, as the heir to the Iron Throne. But Balon followed his brother to the grave nearly a decade later, which forced the issue of the succession once more. By this point, Rhaenys' son Laenor was old enough that many in the realm started backing his claim. This is important to recall because this was changed in the show. In the books, Rhaenys didn't put forward her name alone for the throne. She fought for the claims of her son, and she did get a decent amount of support. The Baratheons, Valyrians, Dragonstone's vassals, Starks, Manderleys, Dustins, and Blackwoods all voted for Laenor. The rest of the realm went to Viserys, and thus was the precedent set. The Great Council wasn't convened just to clear up Jaehaerys' succession. It was called to decide on the matter of how succession was dealt with in Westeros in general. If you'll notice, all of the houses that supported Laenor are houses with traditions that suggest a belief in equal primogeniture. It's hinted that the Valyrians and the Firstmen both believed in making the eldest children leaders of their families. The Wildlings are the only remaining example of true Firstmen culture, and in their culture, both men and women become leaders. In Valyrian houses, there's a custom that the first son must marry his oldest sister. And the fact that both Blackfyre and Dark Sister exist suggests that women had equal footing with men in more ways than one. Aegon Targaryen was specifically mentioned as having to adopt Westerosi customs to be accepted by Westerosi subjects, and this implies that male primogeniture was one of those things. Aegon's initial conquests were done through lands that worshipped the faith of the Seven. He knew that the faith was the primary religion of the continent. The Iron Islands had their own drowned religion, and the old gods were still worshipped above the neck, as well as in a few places below it. But, by and large, the faith dominated Westeros. Even the Iron Islands and the North weren't spared their influence entirely. By the time Aegon crossed the Blackwater, the influence of the faith had shaped the customs and traditions of all the noble houses. The Andals were the ones who insisted on dividing society along gendered lines. Their god has 7 aspects, each representing a gendered foundational role within medieval society. The male aspects are the father, the smith, and the warrior. The father dispenses justice, the smith creates weapons, and the warrior grants strength to the arm of a soldier. All these archetypes are associated with leadership roles within medieval society and literature, so men are inherently set up to be prioritized by the faith. By contrast, the mother, the maiden, and the crone represent love and mercy, purity and innocence, as well as wisdom. Crones are technically leaders too, but a woman is only called a crone after she's lived a long life. To make a long story short, most of Westeros believed in male primogeniture because of the Andal and faith assimilation by the time Aegon arrived. And Jaehaerys was well aware of this as well. To rule over a population as large as theirs, it's necessary to adopt all their major customs, which is why Jaehaerys stubbornly stuck to naming male heirs and was satisfied with Viserys being named as his successor over Laenor or Rhaenys. Rhaenys would have become the first proper ruling queen of Westeros had she been chosen, and that itself could have ignited rebellions all over the realm. Laenor would have claimed the throne as a Valyrian, and that would have made a non-dragon-riding Valyrian family the strongest power in the Seven Kingdoms. House Baratheon was slighted thrice in a way, because the council rejected 3 generations of their descendants, and House Valyrian was furious to say the least. This would be the first of 3 times that the Targaryens would insult the Sea Snake and his house by snubbing them. And Corlys was known far and wide as a great sailor and a prideful man. With the Great Council, it seemed the matter of primogeniture at least was settled. Now, only male heirs could inherit the Iron Throne, and pretty much every other seat of power in Westeros. But for some reason, it wasn't written into formal law. This was only treated as legal precedent, and the thing about precedents is, they're not exactly binding all the time. Yeah, they should be followed, but if you've been paying attention to American news lately, you'll know that ultimately the decision to keep or break with a precedent remains with the judge, which in this case is also the king. That's probably what King Viserys uses to justify his highly divisible decision in the books. The resolution of Jaehaerys' succession left the great powers of Westeros in the following condition. House Arryn became attached to the royal house through Viserys' marriage to his cousin Aemma, the future queen. The Baratheons and Valyrians remained connected to them through Rhaenys and Corlys, and Daemon's marriage to Rhea Royce could have potentially added House Royce to the fold as well, only Daemon didn't really like or care about his wife. In 101 AC, King Viserys I only had 1 child, Rhaenyra, and his unofficial heir was his brother Daemon. If you think that sounds familiar, you're not wrong, because despite revolving his succession crisis, Jaehaerys' family was right back to where it began. Viserys, like his uncle Aemon, didn't have a male child for the majority of his marriage, though it wasn't for a lack of trying. His wife had several stillbirths, but he was confident that one day he would have a son. In the show, this is because he had a dragon dream, but in both continuities, he's proven right and wrong. Viserys does have a male child, but he doesn't outlive his birth for too long, and Aemma dies as well. This makes Rhaenyra his only living child, and Viserys' grief over losing his wife is such that he probably thought in that moment that he'd never marry again. That, plus the council's ruling being a precedent instead of a law, and what his brother says about his son's death, motivates Viserys to name Rhaenyra as his heir. In a way, he was righting the wrongs of the previous generations because his grandmother would have definitely been proud of him, but his grandfather would have been furious, and much of the realm thought the same. Targaryens had pronounced female heirs before. Maegor named his niece Rhaena's eldest daughter, Arya, his heir, and Jaehaerys did the same for the exact same reasons. Neither of them had children of their own at the time, so they basically made do with the only available choice. But as soon as Jaehaerys had a son, he disinherited Arya, because Jaehaerys was always going to have a man succeed him. The biggest difference between Arya and Rhaenyra Targaryen is the fact that Arya was kept as a placeholder until the rightful heir was born, but Rhaenyra was made the rightful heir in the eyes of gods and men. Viserys had all the lords of the realm swear fealty to her in person, and that's quite a serious statement. It means that unless the king says otherwise, Rhaenyra will be the only one to carry forward the Targaryen legacy, even if he has another male child. And this is the stage that both Jaehaerys and Viserys ended up setting for their descendants through their prejudicial choices. While they had the support of several great houses, with Lannisters and Hightowers and Strongs also finding seats at the small council table, the Targaryen dynasty itself became precarious because Viserys broke the precedent. And then, he made matters even worse. Rhaenyra and Alicent, Daemon and Criston Cole, the quartet that started it all. In many ways, the Dance of the Dragons wouldn't have happened if at least two of these four characters didn't exist. But because that's not how things play out, let's talk about the four major players that shift the trajectory of Westeros towards war. We'll start with Daemon Targaryen, the second son of Balon the Brave, rider of Caraxes, wielder of Dark Sister, and the most militarily experienced Targaryen of this generation. Daemon's biggest issue in life was not being born first. For the longest time, he held out hope that he would succeed his brother Viserys as his sole male heir, because he saw only himself as being capable of ruling after him. In the show, he also thinks that during Viserys' rule and wants to be named his hand, but he doesn't directly antagonize his brother in quite the same fashion. Perhaps this is why he never consummates his marriage to Rhea Royce, who in the books dies in a riding accident, but in the show is killed by Daemon. He doesn't think her fit as a royal consort, and he uses Maegor as a precedent to propose marrying Mysaria in the books, which is something he's actually serious about. Mysaria is from Lys there. She has the blood of old Valyria, and this alone makes her more worthy of a Targaryen than any other Westerosi. Lys was established as a pleasure retreat for the Valyrians, and its people are essentially a nation of dragon seeds. Daemon would have technically preserved dragon blood by taking a dragon seed to wife, and unlike the show, where she's from the Yeti and can't have children, book Mysaria can get pregnant. This means that Daemon's child by her would be a pure product of Valyrian genetics, and Daemon is nothing if not a purist when it comes to his identity as a dragon lord. This is why his threat to marry Mysaria has more legs to stand on than his prank from the show, especially because he does end up getting her pregnant. Show Mysaria chooses to abandon Daemon and return to King's Landing, but in the books, Mysaria is exiled by the king and returns to King's Landing after losing her child aboard his ship. The point we're trying to make here is Daemon was completely aware of his inheritance being contingent on his brother not conceiving a son, and he was planning ahead by wanting to take a wife that could produce pure Valyrian sons. Daemon clearly thought of himself as belonging to the same class of Dragon Lord as Aegon the Conqueror and Maegor the Cruel, and while Rhea Royce was never an intended part of his polycule, there was another within the walls of the Red Keep who was. We'll get to that person in a couple minutes because it's better explained from their perspective, but for Daemon, he always viewed his path as one concluding in his coronation. And if you look at Daemon's actions during his time at court, you could kind of see him laying the groundwork for a takeover. Viserys makes him the Master of Coin for a year, then Master of Laws for half a year. When Daemon doesn't display an appetite for governance, Viserys names him Commander of the City Watch, a position Daemon thrives in. Under his leadership, King's Landing's City Watch swells to 2,000 strong, effectively the size of a private army, and are given better equipment than they could have ever dreamed of getting before. Daemon gives his men golden cloaks and wins their loyalty for the rest of his life, and for over half a decade he controls lawlessness in King's Landing with an iron fist. He earns the nicknames Prince of the City and Lord of Fleabottom because of his proclivities, and this period of time in his life truly cements him as the rogue prince. He wasn't named Prince of Dragonstone, but with the gold cloaks in his command, he effectively controlled King's Landing, and that was good enough at the time. We have to point out that each time Daemon was dismissed from a post, the reason given was ineptitude, but the actual reason might just have been enmity. Daemon was shuffled from one post to another by Viserys' hand, Otto Hightower, and he's a guy Daemon warred with his entire life. Like Daemon, Otto is a second son, and so Daemon knows the extent to which second sons will go in order to gain recognition and power. With the City Watch in his command, Daemon could also keep Otto's power in check. And to be frank with you guys, his time as the commander was crucial for King's Landing. In the century that the Targaryens had occupied it, the city's population had exploded, and lawlessness was the norm in the streets. Daemon restored order with his gold cloaks so efficiently that Otto once again suggested he be removed from an important office. While Viserys rejected him at first, he agreed after he learned what Daemon had upset about his wife and son after their tragic deaths. His heir for a day comment is what spurred the king to name Rhaenyra his official heir, and angered by his disinheritance, Daemon flies back to Dragonstone with Mysaria. This is where the whole pregnancy scandal occurs, and after that's resolved, Daemon goes to Driftmark, allies himself with Lord Corlys Velaryon, and launches a private conquest of the Stepstones. His and Corlys' war in the Stepstones would stretch out for several years, and after securing the islands from the Triarchy, Daemon would crown himself King of the Stepstones and the Narrow Sea. He held that title for roughly 2 years, and in the meantime, Corlys' shipping revenue exploded thanks to the Triarchy's expulsion. Ruling from a bunch of rocks bored Daemon though, and it didn't suit his sense of vanity either, which is why he returned to court in the year 111 AC. He yielded his crown to Viserys, was accepted back into his court, and this is where he set his sights on the crown once again, albeit through a different path. All his life, Daemon felt cheated because he knew he was more suited for the throne than his court and ball-loving brother, and that's why he did everything that he did. Though his position was similar to his father's, he wasn't nearly as dedicated to Viserys as Balon was to Aemon. Daemon sought to replace his brother, and the path he chose directly brings us to the second major character of the quartet we mentioned, Rhaenyra Targaryen. The official crown princess, Rhaenyra was called the Realm's Delight when she was young because of her playful nature and her surpassing beauty. Her being the crown princess played a role in her dubbing as well, no doubt. But for the first few years of her life, Rhaenyra was quite insignificant. In fact, she wasn't even factored into her father's selection as the king of Westeros, despite having been born by then. Rhaenyra spent her formative years only as her father's daughter and a princess of the realm. But when her mother and brother died on the same day, her life changed forever. Rhaenyra was named heir to the Iron Throne in defiance of the precedent set by the Great Council, and Viserys made every lord of the Seven Kingdoms swear allegiance to her as the next ruler of Westeros. In the books, Viserys' decision feels solely motivated by his loss. He was said to have loved his wife Aemma Arryn dearly, and though he was obsessed with begetting a male heir, he ultimately never succeeded, so he chose pragmatism instead. Viserys didn't expect to have any more children at the time he named Rhaenyra as his heir, so the decision wasn't protested as fiercely as it might have been by most, save his own brother. Daemon viewed this as a deliberate slight, because of course he did. While he went to Dragonstone, Rhaenyra remained at King's Landing and became a cupbearer for her father. It's said that after being named heir, Rhaenyra seldom left Viserys' side, because he was grooming her for her eventual ascension, and this is where the show and the books begin diverging greatly. In the show, Rhaenyra has Alicent Hightower as a support system early on because both girls are of an age. Now the same's also kind of true in the books, but Alicent and Rhaenyra are never friendly. They have a courteous relationship at best, and that too sours once Alicent makes the move she's most infamous for. She came to King's Landing as part of her father's entourage when he was named Hand to King Jaehaerys, and she would often read to the old king in his final years. It was said that Otto wanted to make Alicent his queen because Alicent had died a few years before the old king, but as it turns out, Otto wasn't eyeing Jaehaerys. In just over a year after Aemma Arryn's death, Alicent had managed to seduce the king well enough for him to declare that he would marry her, and this is also where the second of Corlys' 3 great slights comes into play. After Aemma's death, Viserys had always known he'd need to remarry, but A, he didn't want to, and B, he was more of a lover. Though he was aware the betrothal to Corlys' daughter Laena would make the realm more stable and his throne more secure, Viserys used the girl's age as a pretext to dismiss the match. This caused the rift between him and Corlys that launched the War for the Stepstones. His decision to marry Alicent wasn't one Rhaenyra opposed in the books initially, but as the years passed, it became clear that hostilities were brewing between the princess and the new queen. Before he left court, Daemon Targaryen spent much of his time doting on his niece. Even as a child, Rhaenyra was infatuated by her uncle, and would spend a lot of time in his company, receiving gifts from him. But when Daemon was banished after his heir for a day comment, Rhaenyra's eye turned towards her sworn protector and newly inducted member of the Kingsguard, Criston Cole. In the show, Criston attended the tourney in King's Landing, thrown in anticipation of Queen Emma's latest child. In the books, Cole reached the final moments of a tourney held in Maidenpool in honor of Viserys' ascension, and the fact that he beat Daemon both in the melee and the joust is what made Rhaenyra take notice of him. She petitioned her father to make Cole her sworn shield, and from that day onward, Cole wore her favor in every tourney he participated in. When Sir Ryam Redwine, the legendary Lord Commander of the Kingsguard, passed away after Rhaenyra was named Viserys' official heir, she had Criston given a white cloak, further cementing their relationship as one of deep trust. She'd often call him her White Knight, but as Rhaenyra came into womanhood, the connotations of that nickname changed dramatically. The books make it clear that there was some sort of clandestine relationship between Criston and Rhaenyra, because even in conflicting reports, they're said to have grown intimate with one another. But their affections aren't revealed until Daemon Targaryen returns to King's Landing. After abandoning the Stepstones and being given a place at court again, Daemon pursues a new path to the Iron Throne, and starts indulging his niece's childhood infatuation with him via gifts, jokes, and joyrides on Dragonback across the Narrow Sea. They often go to Dragonstone together, and Daemon starts mocking Rhaenyra's rivals as well, giving them derogatory nicknames. And if that rivals bit caught you slightly off guard, that's because this is where the fourth most consequential person involved in the House of the Dragon comes into play, Alicent Hightower. Now, to be fair, a Targaryen marrying a Hightower isn't unique. In fact, the first marriage that the Targaryens made outside of a Valyrian house was with the Hightowers, when Maegor took Lady Charisse as his wife. The Hightowers ruled from Oldtown, which is where the Citadel and the majority of the Faith's administration is set up. Oldtown itself is the oldest and most well-constructed and possibly richest city in all of Westeros, and the Hightowers were High Kings long before the first men came to the continent. Their heritage alone makes them worthy royal consorts, but the thing is, the Hightowers are slimy as well. They've preserved their power through strategic assimilation, always welcoming change, never seeking unnecessary violence, building a war chest through trade, and securing marriage alliances. When a war breaks out, they prefer playing enemies against each other instead of committing themselves to a cause that they can lose. And Hightower loyalty is often split during the reign of the Targaryens. Judging from the way the Faith protested Maegor's polygamy, and viewed only his marriage to Charisse as being legal, it's clear that the Hightowers have always wanted their blood on the Iron Throne, and Alicent is the one who finally fulfills that desire of theirs. And unlike the show, where her friendship with Rhaenyra makes her hesitant about things, in the books she's clearly working to advance the Hightower agenda at every step. What helped that endeavor was the fact that unlike Queen Aemma, who'd been plagued by stillbirths and couldn't bring forth a son, Alicent was fertile and strong. Within the first year of her marriage to Viserys, she bore him a son they named Aegon. Initially, Alicent didn't press the matter of succession because Viserys himself seemed to refuse to do so. But 3 years after Aegon, Alicent gave birth to her second child, another son named Aemond, and this is where matters start kind of coming to a head. While Alicent wasn't pressing her son's claim, her father most certainly was, often and loudly, bringing up the topic to king and council. Essentially, Viserys got so fed up with Otto's insistence that he sent him packing to Oldtown and named Lionel Stronghand instead. He reaffirmed his daughter's position as heir and openly called out the Hightower attempt to seat their own blood on the throne. This is quite different from the show, as you might have noticed, because in the show, Otto's a lot more subtle and Alicent a lot less insistent. But book Alicent was just built different. As soon as her father departed court, she took up his mantle and continued the fight for her son's rights, and what's private in the show was pretty public in the books. To be fair, her proposal had merits, because if Viserys switched the line of succession, he had an heir and a spare ready to go. He would be aligning himself with centuries of tradition that his grandfather upheld and called a great council to semi-concretize. But the king stood by his daughter steadfastly, so Alicent took another path to fulfilling her plans. This is where we circle back to Criston Cole and Rhaenyra, and the Rogue Prince, because things happened in the 14th year of the princess's life that would set the tone of history for decades to come. Daemon's return to court coincided with the 5th anniversary of Viserys' marriage to Alicent. By this point, he'd had 3 children by her, Aegon, Aemond, and Helaena, all of whom came before Daemon in the line of succession. Even if he never changed the inheritance, should Rhaenyra die childless or all her children die before her, then Aegon would come before Daemon on account of being Viserys' direct descendant. And many in the realm already thought he should be the true heir given the precedent set by the Great Council. With that in mind, Daemon changed tactics and set his eyes on his unmarried heiress of a niece, whom he also knew revered him since childhood. The Rogue Prince didn't ride the lists of the tourney held in honor of his brother's anniversary. The glory of that day belonged to Criston Cole, who unhorsed all of the Green's champions, including Sir Gawain Hightower. But what he did do was start integrating himself with her circle by praising her beauty, lavishing her with gifts, and insulting her step-siblings, which he knew would only make the Greens more belligerent. This was also the anniversary where the princess and the queen's parties got their unofficial names as the Blacks and the Greens, based on Rhaenyra and Alicent's outfits. Now in the show, things were very different because everything we just mentioned happened at Rhaenyra's wedding. In the books, the setup is different because Criston is still a staunch Black supporter at this time. That changes 6 months after the Greens' birth, when it's discovered that Rhaenyra and Daemon had sullied the name of the house by being intimate with one another. Viserys banished his brother once more and made up his mind to marry his daughter, who he started sending out on wedding progresses in earnest. Alicent could have ended the war before it began had Viserys accepted her proposal of betrothing Rhaenyra to Aegon. But Viserys had become wary of his wife's intentions, and despite the smaller age gap between the siblings, he noted that Aegon and Rhaenyra were not fond of one another. While many believe that Daemon only did this because he wanted to become his brother's heir by any means necessary, a small contingent of people believe that Rhaenyra only took lessons from her uncle to satisfy her real lover, Criston Cole. In the show, Rhaenyra goes into Criston's arms after being spurned by Daemon, but in the books, he's always in the picture as a potential romantic interest. And that's proven true when, a while after Daemon's banishment, Cole suddenly and abruptly switches his allegiance to the Greens. Some say he petitions to Rhaenyra to run away to Essos like in the show, while others believe the princess goes to him in person and is spurned by him. We personally think that Rhaenyra cheated on Criston with Harwin Strong, and he found out, because shortly after his defection, she returns to Dragonstone with Harwin as her personal shield. He was clearly on her radar, and considering how their relationship alters the trajectory of the story, it makes sense that Cole discovering them together could lead to him seeing things Alicent's way, who has always hated how spoiled her stepdaughter has been. Whatever the truth is, the fact remains that Cole defected to the Greens after the Blacks started looking for suitable prospects for Rhaenyra. He didn't do something stupid as to turn a man's face into mulch in front of an entire court in a blind fit of rage, so clearly Book Cole was smarter as well. During this time, Daemon languished in Bloodstone, and when his wife died of an accident, which really was an accident in the books, he tried claiming Runestone. Failing that, he didn't go to his niece's wedding, but instead arranged his own by flying to Driftmark from the Vale and laying eyes on Corlys's daughter Laena Velaryon. She was a great beauty, once thought fit to be the next queen of Westeros. After Viserys rejected her, Corlys betrothed her to the son of the Sea Lord of Braavos, but the Sea Lord lost his power and the son essentially started mooching off him. He couldn't break the betrothal honorably, so when Daemon offered to free him of his burdens, he was only too happy to betroth his daughter to his old war buddy. This would be a third Valyrian Targaryen marriage in 2 generations, because the year before Daemon's marriage to Laena, Rhaenyra was married to Corlys' son and heir, Laenor Velaryon, who was now Prince Consort and future King Consort. In 115 AC, things were tenuously stable because the primary instigators of the dance had been separated from one another. Part of Rhaenyra's betrothal also included her taking her place at Dragonstone, because that's traditionally a seat of the Targaryen heir. With her husband Laenor and her new sworn shield Harwin, she could set up an entire household loyal to her alone in opposition to Alicent's in King's Landing. Daemon had taken flight for the Free Cities with his new bride because they didn't marry with the king's consent. He and Laena would travel from Pentos to Volantis to Cahora to Norvos, and they would return to Pentos when Laena became pregnant with her twin girls, Baela and Rhaena. Because of their age, the couple would stay in Pentos, and all of this gave Viserys 15 or so Daemon-free months. As for Criston, after taking up her quote-unquote true queen, he personally oversaw the growth of her sons as warriors. Alicent was more determined to get Viserys to change his mind after watching the Blacks throw their full support behind Rhaenyra. She didn't have her father by her side, but she had Criston now, and in the books, she was arguably a bigger instigator than Otto himself. This is the political situation of the royal family of Westeros in 116 AC, and now you'll understand why we call this stability tenuous at best.
To unite the realm against the cold and the dark.
Death and deceptions. What led to civil war? While the House of the Dragon decided to make Viserys Baldwin the fourth from the very first episode, he didn't have that affliction in the books. Therefore, his demise had an even greater impact than show Viserys' tragic story arc, because in the source material, he was the only true shield guarding Rhaenyra's claim. From this point onward, we'll be focusing on the books because we hope we've addressed enough show changes to impress upon you that the House of the Dragon is an adaptation. And Viserys being hale and hearty in the books played a key role in that tenuous stability we just mentioned. Show Viserys' pain was prolonged by Grand Maester Malos, who refused to change his treatment to kill him slowly, presumably in collusion with Otto Hightower. But Book Viserys' only issue for the longest time was his girth, and the fact that he would cut himself on the Iron Throne from time to time. This change is important to note because after 115 AC, things at court and Dragonstone change quite rapidly. While Rhaenyra stays at her family's ancestral island fortress, her sons are pretty much raised in the capital on Viserys' order. She frequents court, yes, but her eldest son Jacaerys' birth coincides with that of Viserys' last son, Daeron. So he decrees that the two boys be made milk brothers and raised and weaned at the same breast. From the beginning, he was aware of his grandson's potential illegitimacy, so he took covert steps to assure that he'd be accepted. Viserys was the one who decreed Jace, Luke, and Joff be given dragon eggs, that they read, write, learn, and train with Aegon, Aemond, and Daeron, and that the 6 siblings treat each other like true brothers instead of halves. Show Viserys is portrayed as being blissfully ignorant of things, but Book Viserys' cunning shines through in moments like these. He knows that Alicent personally trained her children to hate Rhaenyra's, and though his decisions were more hopeful than strategic, they at least cemented him as the man in charge of the entire household. In the show, Alicent and Otto end up running things as Viserys' condition deteriorates, but even Otto's return to court is tempered by the king's health. Viserys remains in relative decent health, and has control over affairs of state from 115 AC to 126 AC, despite Otto's return at the halfway point of those years. His intentional blindness and acts of protection made it clear to the realm that no one was going to depose his daughter. Between 115 and 126 AC, Rhaenyra's kids and Alicent's kids grew up side by side under that tenuous peace we mentioned. Lionel Strong was still Viserys' hand, and the small council was still filled with Viserys loyalists, so affairs of state proceeded smoothly. Still, both sides shored up what alliances they could because they knew that war was not entirely outside the realm of possibility. Alicent got her children Aegon and Helaena married, sent Daeron to foster at Oldtown after a while, and Aemond grew into the finest warrior on the Green side, under the watchful eye of Criston Cole. Aegon and Helaena became dragon riders as well, claiming Sunfire and Dreamfire, while Aemond remained dragonless and frustrated. On Dragonstone and Driftmark, the Targaryen-Valyrian bonds deepened further as Rhaenyra took to flying frequently with her uncle and her sister-in-law Laena Velaryon. She had 3 sons during this time, and while all of them looked more like Harwin Strong than they did her husband Laenor, Rhaenyra had more of a pretext to stand upon in the books. Rhaenys Baratheon's ancestry had given her black hair, so her being Laenor's mother could explain Jace, Luke, and Joff's dark hair. And Viserys ensured that his court saw Jace, Rhaenyra's eldest, as his acknowledged heir after her. He once sat with the boy on the Iron Throne while holding court and told him that one day all that was his would be Jace's. Alicent sniped Rhaenyra every time she presented a new kid at court because she could see that her kids were Harwins, but Viserys was content with the explanation we just mentioned, a version of which he gave to his wife in the show, albeit with horses. Rhaenyra knew that her kids' claims would always be questioned because of their lineage, so she made the only choice she could to protect that secret and got her eldest sons betrothed to Daemon's twin daughters with her father's leave. Since this match not only preserved the royal tradition of Targaryens taking Valyrian brides and grooms, and cemented Viserys' own alliance with the richest house in the realm, he had no problem with the proposal, which was made as almost an afterthought in the show. Rhaenyra, Daemon, Laena, and Laenor turned the Islands of the Gullet into a new Valyria for half a decade, while Viserys held down the fort for his grandsons in King's Landing. Then the year 120 came, and the House Targaryen was afflicted by the Red Spring. 3 deaths occurred back-to-back that crippled this tenuous peace. The first was Laena of Valyrians, which occurred on Driftmark instead of Pentos. She died trying to birth a child, but wasn't burned by Vhagar so much as she tried and failed to go on a final ride with her. At Laena's funeral, Aemond finally gained a dragon by bonding with Vhagar. The 2 sets of princes had their first massive fight. Aemond lost an eye to Jason Luke, and Sir Harwin Strong was packed off to Harrenhal after Aemond called his nephews strong bastards. Then Sir Harwin died, along with Viserys' hand Lionel, at a mysterious fire that engulfed their quarters in Harrenhal. Many names were put forth as the prospective arsonist, including Daemon, Laenor, and Viserys himself, but the show picked the most likely culprit as its perpetrator in Larys Strong. This tracks with his actions from the book as well, because Larys sides against his father and House's established interests later on in the story. After Lionel's death, Viserys could have taken on a brand new hand of the king, but preferring familiarity and having considered the matter of succession settled, he recalled Otto Hightower to court, which proved to be his first big mistake. That's because his daughter ended up providing even more proof to the realm of her children's illegitimacy. Shortly after Laena Valyrian's death, her brother and Rhaenyra's husband, Laenor Velaryon, dies as well, although his death is a public affair and Rhaena isn't implicated one bit. In the show, she stages Laenor's death at Laena's funeral and marries her uncle pretty much the day after everything's concluded. In the books, Laenor dies after quarreling with his rumored lover, Carl Corey, in Spicetown, which is nice and public. She and Daemon wait half a year after Laenor's death to get married to one another, which was still more scandalous than their marriage was in the show, and they have a son they named Aegon before the year is up. With both of Corlys' children dead, the Targaryen-Valyrian alliance is now held together by his and Viserys' grandchildren, and Rhaenyra furthered her military position by marrying her uncle, a recognized and renowned warrior. She'd have another child with Daemon within a couple years of the Red Spring, and this boy would be named Viserys after her father. While it was great that Rhaenyra had 5 sons as the heiress of Westeros, the fact that her youngest looked like proper Targaryens where her eldest did not pose a major threat to her rule. That threat was amplified when Aegon and Helaena had 3 children of their own in Jaehaerys, Jaehaera, and Maelor. Only the children from Rhaenyra's first marriage to Laenor did not look like Targaryens, and the fact that every child of the next generation had either hatched or bonded with a dragon save the infants Viserys and Maelor didn't exactly give people the clarity they were hoping for. Viserys remained intentionally blind until the year 127, which is when things started bubbling over. In the show, Vaemon Valerian was presented as Corlys' brother and the only other Valerian outside of the main branch. But in the books, Vaemon was one of the 6 nephews of Corlys, all of whom felt that they stood to inherit Driftmark over Rhaenyra's sons. Technically speaking, the inheritance of Driftmark should have passed from Corlys to Laenor to Jace as Laenor's oldest acknowledged son. But by the time the year 127 rolled around, the truth about the bastardy of Rhaenyra's children had taken root within her own house. In Fire and Blood, it was she, not Corlys, who wished for Lucerys to take over Driftmark after his demise. And Corlys' nephews took it upon themselves to press their claims when their old liege lord fell ill at the age of 73. Rhaenyra had Daemon execute the oldest, Vaemon, but the other 5 sailed to King's Landing to petition the king himself. In the show, Viserys was too old and frail and sickly to make good on his threat of cutting Vaemon's tongue out, but in the books, he was well enough to order that for all of Corlys' remaining nephews, who were forever remembered as the Silent Five. 3 of them fought and died for the Greens when the dance broke out properly, and 2 continued to hold out against the Blacks after the war until they were dealt with in earnest. But Viserys literally silencing petitions that questioned his grandson's legitimacy furthered his practice when it came to their parentage, which was to sweep it under the rug and forget about it. He might have succeeded in making the realm hold its tongue in perpetuity had he outlived his own folly. But alas, while delivering the sentence to the Silent Five, he cut his hand to the bone upon the Iron Throne. Grand Maester Melos, who was a Hightower supporter and also really old, just couldn't heal him. Rhaenyra had to bring Gerardis from Dragonstone to save her father's life, but even though Gerardis cut off the king's infected fingers, he couldn't do anything to stop the after effects of the fever that his infection had afflicted him with. Rhaenyra suspected that the Greens intended to let her father die, and suggested Gerardis be named Grand Maester after Melos' death. Alicent countermeasured by suggesting a Hightower Maester, and Viserys instead sent to the Citadel for a new Grand Maester, choosing neutral tradition over partisan council politics. This would be the last proper decision King Viserys takes in his own name, because the books state that Orwyle's appointment to the Small Council was the last to take place before the Civil War broke out. This means that Otto had started stacking the council with his lackeys in Larys, Jasper Wilde, and Tywin Lannister shortly after his appointment, with Lyman Beesbury being the only original member of Viserys' small council left. Despite that, it appears as though he still managed to maintain some form of balance for close to 2 years, seeing as he only became indisposed to attend council meetings just a couple months before his actual death. And when that death occurred, Viserys didn't go out mumbling about prophecies or Aegon the Conqueror's dream, both of which aren't recorded as driving forces in terms of his choice of successor. From this point, things play out quite similar to how they do in the show, with 2 major differences. The first is that Alicent is as involved in the plans of the Green Council as her father, whereas in the show she was effectively marginalized. The second is Rhaenys was nowhere near King's Landing during Aegon's coronation. Apart from that, the details of Viserys' death being hidden until Aegon was crowned, the flight of Black Loyalist Kingsguard members, Criston Cole being seen as a kingmaker for his role in convening the Green Council, all of it's pretty much the same. These are all the deaths and depictions that made the Civil War break out, because when the Greens crown Aegon, they're basically creating a situation similar to Viserys' succession crisis. Now that we've discussed all the politics and forbidden romance that led to this place, let's talk about the dance proper. The Battles of the Dance, the entire Civil War. The Targaryen Civil War had 4 major theaters of war, with a 5th one forming way off into the west. Unlike the TV show where Otto Hightower leaves King's Landing after Aegon replaces him with Criston Cole, he stays in the capital in the books, where he also makes major changes to support his new regime. For instance, he names his son Gwaine second in command to Luther Largent, to keep an eye on him considering his loyalties previously belonged to Daemon. Gwaine gets an expanded role in the TV series, but that also deprives us of a lot of Otto's ingenuity, because he pretty much architects the Greens' entire campaign within a few weeks of the war breaking out. Otto is the one who decides to send Aemon to Storm's End to parley with the prickly Lord Barros Baratheon, to send letters to every great house in the realm, as well as entirely new players, so they can muddy the game further. In the show, it's Aemon's idea to get the Triarchy on the Greens' side, and the Small Council's idea to add Dalton Greyjoy to their midst by offering Alicent's hand in marriage to him. But in the books, Otto makes those decisions. He makes them well in advance, and he doesn't need to use his daughter as a bargaining chip. He offers Dalton the position of Master of Ships as part of his deal, and he tells his nephew Ormond to bring the Hightower army down on the Blacks in the Reach, chief of whom included House Beesbury, after Lyman Beesbury was effectively murdered by the Green Council. Otto also makes overtures to Sunspear because Daemon and Corlys' war in the Stepstones involved Dorne as well, and had Aegon remained patient with his grandsire, he'd probably have won the war without needing to leave the Red Keep. Sadly, his blood runs hot as his paternal family's motto, and when Otto's diplomacy doesn't pay off quick enough for him, he replaces the man with Criston Cole, which was the single most disastrous decision he could have made. We'll get to that in just a few minutes, because first, we need to talk about Rhaenyra's response to Aegon's coronation. As soon as she learned about the Green's treachery, Rhaenyra went into labor, but produced a stillbirth and her only daughter/lizard baby Viserys. After recovering from this loss enough to take charge of her war, she was crowned with her father and grandfather's crown when Steffon Darklyn arrived on Dragonstone with it, and the first thing she did was declare Alicent and Otto traitors. Initially, Rhaenyra was inclined to spare her half-siblings because she knew that their strings were being pulled by their ancestors. When Orwyle put together a delegation to bring terms to Dragonstone, Rhaenyra rejected those terms and specifically named Otto and Alicent as the only targets of her ire. Meanwhile, Aegon couldn't stop calling his half-sister all sorts of sordid names, which no doubt contributed to many of the lords siding with the Blacks. Like Otto, Rhaenyra too had the idea of sending messengers to important lords of the Seven Kingdoms, but she had more riders available. In addition to Winterfell, Jace flew to the Eyrie, the Three Sisters, and White Harbor, treating with House Arryn, Sunderland, Burrell, and Manderley directly. He spent a lot longer in the north as well, allegedly getting involved with Cregan Stark's bastard sister and forming the Pact of Ice and Fire with him. Torrhen Manderley entered the dance because of Jace's visit, not because he randomly showed up at the capital one day and the Manderleys supported Rhaenyra directly for much of her campaign with soldiers. Torrhen himself was sent to the Queen to treat with her and fight for her, while the Vale, the Sisters, and Winterfell itself pledged their forces to her cause. The Crown Prince's negotiations could have gone better for him, to be sure, as the Vale demanded a dragon in exchange for soldiers, and White Harbor a marriage. But, given the circumstances, Jace did the best anyone could have. The Vale was related to Rhaenyra by her mother, and the Manderleys had been promised a royal marriage by Jaehaerys, the Conciliator, which was now being taken up by the Blacks. Jace decided to betroth his youngest brother Joffrey to Lord Desmond Manderley's daughter, and this mirrors Aemon's own arrangement with the Baratheons, where he proposes to marry one of Lord Boros' daughters after the war. While Jace flew to the north, Daemon, who was named Lord Protector at Rhaenyra's coronation, flew to the Riverlands to secure Harrenhal, and started rallying rivermen to Rhaenyra's banner. Luke was sent to Storm's End, which Rhaenyra thought would have been the easier mission, but ended up losing his life to Aemon's wrath and Boros' pride, none of which was presented as a mistake. When Daemon got word of Luke's death at Harrenhal, which he took single-handedly using only Caraxes as his army, he sent a message to Dragonstone telling Rhaenyra her son would be avenged, and another to King's Landing to put that vengeance into motion. Using Mysaria, whom he'd had decent relations with in the books, he engineered the death of Aegon's heir at the hands of Blood and Cheese. In the show, Blood and Cheese's attack was impromptu. Helaena chose Jaehaera over Jaehaerys, and Alicent was in bed with Criston Cole when the attack occurred. In the books, Alicent was bound by Blood and Cheese, for she spent most of her time with Helaena, and Helaena herself was made to choose between her two sons, Jaehaerys and Maelor. She chose Maelor, and Blood and Cheese killed Jaehaerys instead, and this is what marked Helena's descent into madness. She felt immense guilt having to look at the son she chose to die, and she started refusing food and drink, lost sleep, and was separated from the king as well as Maelor, who was given to Alicent to raise. It's only after his son's death that the quote-unquote king becomes a greater part of his own conspiracy and starts making moves that unravel his entire campaign. He fires Otto and promotes Criston Cole, who tells him to hang every holdout rebel lord to prove to the realm that Aegon came to play ball. Characters like Lady Fell and Lord Merryweather, who are still alive in the show, were put to the sword by the Greens in the books. Cole also sent one Cargill twin to kill another, made plans to retake the Crownlands from the rebels, and eventually march on and root Daemon out of Harrenhal. His advance was swift up until Duskendale, with Cole's army subduing every castle and city on their way north. But when the Greens reached Rook's Rest, that's when things started turning ugly. At the beginning of the war, Rhaenyra had commanded that the Gullet be blockaded by the Valyrian fleet, and she'd recognized that despite having more dragons on her side, her riders were inexperienced, and all their riders combined wouldn't be a match for Aemond and Vhagar, which is different from her initial assertions for a peace resolution to the conflict from the show. In the books, Luke's loss itself hits Rhaenyra so hard that she doesn't exactly think or talk about peace at any point, especially because her relationship with Alicent is entirely different. There's no warmth or shared memories of childhood, there's just bitterness and hatred, and Rhaenyra is completely fine with allowing things to happen that might or might not sully her name. Though the books never focus on this, the show's decision to have Otto dub her Rhaenyra the Cruel by parading Jaehaerys' body through the streets was clever, because it directly set the stage for everything that transpires in the Riverlands. This is in direct conflict with Daemon's entire Harrenhal arc, however, because he doesn't linger there nearly as long as he does in the show. Neither does he have a religious awakening or any notable interactions with Alice Rivers, both of which become defining parts of his Harrenhal experience. After reaching Black Heron's Folly, Daemon gets to work on immediately sorting the Riverlands out, starting with the Blackwoods and the Brackens. Unlike the show, Daemon puts his full support behind the Blackwoods when they start warring with the Brackens again because the Blackwoods were the first Riverlands house to declare for Rhaenyra. The Brackens declared for Aegon, naturally, and House Tully would have done the same had its liege Grover Tully not been bedridden. But because he was, the Tullys stayed out of the war until they knew they could pick a winning side. Daemon's alliance with the Blackwoods led to the Battle of the Burning Mill, where the Blackwoods lost and incurred heavy losses. But the Burning Mill served as a distraction because it allowed Daemon himself to occupy the Bracken seat of Stonehenge and turn those two houses' ancient rivalry into a temporary alliance. Once he accomplished this, most river houses, save the Tullys, sided with the Blacks and fought in the Wars of the Dance. This first host of Rivermen fought 4 crucial battles, being augmented by Roddy the Ruin's Winter Wolves by the third. The first 2 were the Battle of the Red Fork and the Battle of Acorn Hall, where the Rivermen faced the entire might of Castle Rock. Lord Jason Lannister led his men into war, fought on the front lines, and died at the hands of a titleless man called Pates, who was thereafter remembered as the Lion Slayer. Several common and bastard men made names for themselves during the dance, like Pate, but we doubt you'll hear of them in the show. The Lannister army of stragglers were vanquished in the Battle of the Lakeshore, where the Winter Wolves and the River Army smashed the Westerlanders to pieces. This left the West completely undefended, with a child being the next Lord of Castle Rock and his mother being his regent as well. This promoted Dalton Greyjoy to accept the Blacks' proposal over the Greens' offer, because where the Greens tried to buy his loyalty with an office, the Blacks only told him to reave and raid as his ancestors once did. The Iron Islands and the Westerlands would be locked in a private war between themselves for the remainder of the dance, and thus incapacitated. The fourth major battle fought in the Riverlands we'll get to in just a moment, but before we do that, we need to check in on the Gullet. After Jace returned from his voyage north, he took charge of his mother's council, unlike the show where he was but a glorious accessory. While Daemon consolidated his power in the Riverlands, Rhaenyra languished in grief on Dragonstone, and this allowed the Greens to make significant headway into her territory. After taking several castles and towns that had declared for the Blacks, Criston Cole's army headed towards Rook's Rest to stamp out her foothold on the mainland. Lord Staunton sent a plea for aid to his queen and got a dragon in return as Rhaenys flew to Rook's Rest on Meleys's back. But this is exactly what Cole wanted, because he then loosed both Vhagar and Sunfire upon the Red Queen. In the show, it's clear that Cole's plan was only to involve Aemon and Vhagar, where the books make it look like Vhagar and Sunfire were always meant to fight together. This is one of the rare instances where we think the show is more direct than the books, because it always felt wrong that of the 3 dragons that fought above Rook's Rest, only Sunfire and Meleys took critical damage. The show wanted people to think Sunfire was dead, in fact, and that's not the case in the books. While he is critically injured, he's also very much alive and is being kept alive by the garrison that Criston Cole leaves at Rook's Rest after he defeats Rhaenys and kills both her and Meleys. Aegon is transported back to the Red Keep along with the rest of Cole's army, while Daemon campaigns in the Riverlands. Rhaenys' death estranged Corlys Velaryon from Rhaenyra for a time, which seemed to happen more frequently in the show, but he was reconciled with his daughter-in-law by his grandson. Jace was the one who named Corlys Hand and proposed the sowing of the dragon seeds. He's the one who sends Joffrey and Rhaena to the Vale, and his youngest brothers Aegon and Viserys to Pentos, because he knows that dividing royal heirs across waters gives their cause a much better chance at surviving. Jace is wise enough to send both Joff's dragon, which is much larger in the books, and a clutch of dragon eggs with Rhaena to the Vale. And Rhaena is wise enough not to do the whole pick me dad routine that she's doing in the TV show. During her time in the East, she becomes a second realm's delight of sorts, and the Valemen grow so fond of her that they join the war as much for Rhaena as they do for Rhaenyra. Plus, Jane Eyre doesn't have as much of a ground to dismiss helping her queen, because technically speaking, Joff's dragon is big enough to ride and therefore fly to the Vale's defense. In fact, Adam and Alan of Hull would have been legitimized by now had Jace still been alive, because he ensures Rhaenyra names them Velaryons shortly after the Red Sowing is complete. In the books, the Blacks gain not 3 but 4 new dragon riders. Both Adam and Alan make an attempt at claiming a dragon, but where Adam succeeds, Alan fails. The 4th rider is a nut brown girl called Nettles, whose arc has been controversially merged with Rhaena's by the TV show. Hugh Hammer is a blacksmith in the books, and Ulf a man-at-arms for the Targaryens. All 4 dragon riders seemed loyal to the Crown Prince right after they were elevated by their new possessions, but only 2 of them kept that loyalty alive for the rest of their lives. That's because the Battle of the Gullet is the only battle where Ulf and Hugh fought for the side that gave them power. Shortly after putting Aegon and Viserys on the Gay Abandon, Jace's careful planning is tested when the Triarchy attacks the Valyrian blockade out of nowhere. His new dragon riders distinguish themselves in battle by burning the Triarchy's fleet so thoroughly that his grandpa doesn't have to hunt stragglers later on, But the gullet also ends with Jace's death and the sacking of both Spicetown and High Tide, the richest locations on the island of Driftmark. This is when Rhaenyra decides to take matters into her own hands and unleashes her dragons upon the capital. Vhagar and Aemon be damned. In the show, there's this extremely complicated and frankly stupid plotline that sees Alicent manipulating Aemon into leaving King's Landing. But in the books, things are blessedly simple. By the time the Greens return to the capital with their injured king, they've realized the Daemon's River army cannot be ignored any longer, and so they set out for Harrenhal at once. Crucially, Aemon doesn't take Blackfyre, doesn't name himself king, and doesn't have an incestuous kiss with his mom. He marches to Harrenhal with Cole and his army for 19 full days, and when he gets there, he thinks he's won because Daemon is nowhere to be found. That joy turns into ashes in Aemon's mouth when he realizes that Daemon didn't tuck tail and run, he outmaneuvered him. Mysaria informed him of Aemon's departure. He coordinated with Rhaenyra, and the Blacks took the capital as soon as Vhagar left King's Landing. Lord Larys Strong smuggled Aegon II out of the capital before the commotion of Rhaenyra's appearance in the skies died down. And if appearances were the truth, then in that one moment, Rhaenyra had won. She had most of the Green Council executed, starting with Otto, who wasn't a gift from Larys Strong. She kept Tywin Lannister and Orwyle alive because she knew they might give her useful information with the right amount of persuasion. And Alicent and Helena were spared as well, but her stance on her half-brothers had changed. Rhaenyra now wanted them dead because in her mind, they refused positions of honor at her court by rebelling against her. She was more lenient with the lords and ladies of the realm than Aegon and Criston had been, but when it came to the small folk, Rhaenyra's luck was rotten. In the show, Mysaria helps her endear herself to the small folk because the two women form a bond on Dragonstone, which is where they get acquainted. In the books, Mysaria only shows her face at court after Rhaenyra secures the throne, and then too is known as Daemon's White Worm more than Rhaenyra's unofficial Mistress of Whispers. Rhaenyra might use Mysaria's small folk-oriented outlook to her advantage when she wants to bring Daemon to heel in the show, but in the books, that's not present. In fact, many in King's Landing resent her for depriving them of food thanks to her blockade. And when she sends Knights Inquisitors into the streets to look for an escaped Aegon, their forceful nature turns the populace against Rhaenyra within half a year. During that time, several developments take place elsewhere, so let's talk about them first. After King's Landing falls, Aemon and Cole, who've reached Harrenhal, disagree on their next course of action. Aemon prefers to stay and raid the Riverlands, but Cole wants to regroup and reorganize, so they split up. Aemon uses Vhagar to wage a guerrilla campaign in the Riverlands, having taken Alice Rivers as his bedmate after putting Simon Strong's line and effectively House Strong to the sword. Cole marches down south, hoping to join his strength to the Hightower army that had long since left Oldtown. This is where his fortunes sour, because the Blacks not only know his position, they lure him into a trap. In the show, Cole's Cloak and Dagger campaign claims Lord Piper's life, but in the books, it's Cole and his army that march to their deaths, being greeted by feasting corpses along their trail. The Blacks use the bodies they collected from their first 3 victories in the Riverlands to secure their 4th, because they hide soldiers among the grisly displays they erect to ambush and kill the Kingmaker's ragtag detachment. When Cole's army is finally surrounded by the remnants of the First River Army, under the command of young Lord Benjicott Blackwood and Roderick Dustin's Winter Wolves, he first asks if his men will be spared when he surrenders. When he's refused, Cole offers to fight all of the Blacks' commanding officers, which is a 3-on-1 disadvantage for him. But this is where the show reveals its ignorance, because the show tries portraying Criston as this common man, champion of true warriors and struggling to cling to his knighthood by any means. In the books, the most iconic line associated with Cole comes from a houseless hedge knight, when Pate the Lion Slayer tells him that he won't have any more songs sung of him, seeing as tens of thousands were dead on his account. Pate's archers, not Black Alley Blackwood, strike down Criston Cole at his command. Although, Alley is involved with the war effort, just in a different way. We'll get to that in a few minutes, but first let's wrap up talking about the battles. While the Riverlands yield a net victory for the Blacks with Aemon on Vhagar being the biggest green threat north of King's Landing, the south proves to be a more favorable theater for the Hightowers. Ormond's march to the capital is extremely perilous. Only those houses that sit close to Oldtown declare for the Greens, with the rest of the Reach declaring for the Blacks and the Tyrells of Highgarden themselves remaining neutral. Ancient families like Rowan and Tarly were among Rhaenyra's supporters, and these supporters harried Ormond's lines until the decisive Battle of the Honeywine, where the Hightowers secured their first major victory thanks to Prince Daeron. Their side appeared to be losing until Daeron flew to war at the back of his young blue queen of a dragon called Tessarion. When he landed, Ormond dubbed him Daeron the Daring. The Hightowers besieged Longtable after the battle, taking the castle with honor, but at their next location, the Green's army became a lot more hostile. Turns out, Aegon Targaryen wasn't the only person who was missing from the Red Keep when Rhaenyra arrived. it was him and his heirs. Larys Strong and Alicent Hightower had concocted a plan to send Aegon's remaining children to safety in the south. His daughter Jaehaera was sent to Storm's End with Sir Willis Fell, and his youngest son Maelor was sent to Oldtown with Sir Record Thorne. Side note, but everything Alicent does in Season 3 after her little girl talk session with Rhaenyra is a friggin' insult to this man's courage, because he literally dies protecting her grandson. See, Jaehaera arrives at Storm's End just fine, because the Stormlands are the only location left untouched by the war, and Boros Baratheon is already allied with the Greens through a betrothal. But Rickard Thorne's journey to Ormond Hightower's army in Oldtown goes through Black territory, and this puts Maelor's life at immense danger, especially because he's also traveling with his dragon egg. Rickard and Maelor are discovered at the Black-aligned town of Bitterbridge in the Reach, where they both die gruesome deaths. When word reaches Ormond's army, Daeron himself is in favor of burning and sacking Bitterbridge because he wants to avenge his fallen nephew. The Greens bring the savage energy to Tumbleton as well, which is also sacked and looted by them in the books, not occupied semi-respectfully as Ormond does in the show. In fact, Ormond doesn't survive the first Battle of Tumbleton, and he doesn't even step foot within the city. We'll get to more on that in a few minutes, because first, we need to go back to the Crownlands for a quick check-in. While the Green and Black armies are marching toward the same destination, Tumbleton, developments occur at Dragonstone and King's Landing that once again change the face of the game. After learning of Aemon's guerrilla campaign in the Riverlands, Rhaenyra dispatches Daemon and Nettles to Maidenpool to set up a base there and bring the One-Eyed Prince to her. Lord Mootton had previously tried slaying the injured Sunfire for Rhaenyra, but when he failed at doing that, he provided his city, which was mostly left intact by the war, and its resources to the King Consort for his efforts. Each day, Daemon and Nettles flew north on Caraxes and Sheepstealer, looking for Vhagar, and people in Maidenpool noted that they were close to one another, almost like a father and daughter more than inappropriate lovers. And we'll get to why we specifically pointed that out in a moment as well. While Daemon searched the skies for his brother, Aegon did the unthinkable and repaid Rhaenyra's capture of King's Landing in kind. After escaping the city, he was sent to Dragonstone by Larys Strong under the watchful eye of a bastard knight and the brothers Tangletongue, because Larys rightly guessed that no one would think to look for him at the Queen's own stronghold. As Aegon regains his strength, he discovers that Sunfire has returned to Dragonstone as well, and the pair start healing in earnest. Once they're both strong enough, they flew to the castle, which has a small force defending it, and attempt to take it. But there, they're hindered by the efforts of the most fiery Targaryen, and perhaps the most misrepresented character of all of the House of the Dragon, Baela Targaryen. In the show, Baela's flying all over the place, helping Adam track Vhagar near Harrenhal, hooking up with Alan in the Dragon Pit. But in the books, Baela's left at Dragonstone, and this becomes a silver lining for the Greens because it gives them a valuable hostage. While Baela and Moondancer do their best to kill Sunfire and Aegon, they only manage to further injure them, and only Sunfire's wounds later proving to be fatal. Moondancer ends up dying, and Baela is imprisoned as Dragonstone falls to Aegon, word of which is kept restricted to the island. In the meantime, Rhaenyra responds to the Hightower army in the south with Dragonfire, and gets burnt herself by treachery instead. She dispatches Ulf and Hugh to join the First River Army, which had been commanded to take on the Hightower army near Tumbleton. At this point, even with the Winter Wolves, this army only numbered around 6,000, and Ormond had several times the Black's numbers. Ulf and Hugh were sent to even those odds, but in sending them, Rhaenyra makes the mistake of not accounting for their nature. The show makes Ulf a tragic drunk who's only seeking to reaffirm the reality of the stories he once told of himself, and who craves the freedom he once had as a free man. And Hugh is still a blacksmith, but he's somehow buffoonish, brave, and bewilderingly tone-deaf all at the same time. We've spent entirely too much time focusing on Hugh's exceptionally poor treatment of his wife, especially after their daughter's death, if you ask us. Because in the books, Hugh's merely a brute and Ulf is merely a drunk. After taking King's Landing, Corlys gives Rhaenyra sound advice by asking her to send peace terms to Castle Rock, Oldtown, and Storm's End, because that's how the war will really come to an end. But she refuses because she's still feeling that fire and blood energy. Daemon actually takes things a step further by suggesting they root out the Lannisters and the Hightowers and install Hugh and Ulf as Great Lords instead, which horrifies Corlys because he always sees the big picture. While that might assure their alliances as fellow Dragon Lords, the rest of the realm will not stay silent for short, let alone long, if that decision goes through. And Corlys storms off to convince Rhaenyra this is a bad idea. Ulf and Hugh felt rejected that day and realized they would never rise further than they already had. So they made the decision to seek greener pastures with the Greens, and with a few quiet words, turned to their cloaks right as the first Battle of Tumbleton broke out. The Blacks, despite being outnumbered, killed thousands upon thousands of Greens, including Ormond Hightower. But in the end, Roddy the Ruin, his Winter Wolves, and the rest of the First River Army were burned to ash by Daeron, Ulf, and Hugh. They then sacked Tumbleton and dug in to plan their next move.
with Darren as its centerpiece, or at least that's how it's supposed to go. After First Tumbleton, Rhaenyra became extremely paranoid and went into overdrive, making bad decisions. She first commanded Corlys to arrest his own son Adam, who had been given the traditional post of Dragon Pit Keeper, because she was afraid he'd betray her just like Ulf and Hugh. When she initially took Mysaria into her service, Rhaenyra was dismissive of her previous relationship with Daemon, but when Mysaria told her that Daemon was forming a new one with Nettles and Maidenpool, Rhaenyra commanded Lord Mooten to send her the girl's head as proof of both his and Daemon's loyalty. Lord Mooten was appalled by this demand, as it didn't just violate guest right, it was against the very concept of a queen ruling with decency. He had the command brought to Daemon at once, who in turn commanded Nettles to fly away to safety, while he himself traveled to Harrenhal to await Aemon's arrival. Daemon had spread the word of his journey, and on the 14th day of his lonesome vigil in Harrenhal's Godswood, Aemon arrived. He had Alice Rivers with him, who he called his lady and kissed passionately. She had a swollen belly indicating her pregnancy, and in the books, Alice was implied to be a fire mage and a shadowbinder like Melisandre, not an old god's witch like in the show. She watched the grand battle between Daemon and Caraxes and Aemon and Vhagar from the top of the Kingspire Tower, and bore witness to the end of two who could have been kings. All 4 human and dragon participants in the battle above the God's Eye died that day, but their lineages didn't. Daemon's was still alive, and his twin daughters and one of his sons to the best of his knowledge. Before the Battle of the Gullet broke out, Aegon of Viserys' transport ship was attacked by the Triarchy pirates, but while Viserys was taken captive by them, Aegon managed to fly back to Dragonstone on his dragon Stormcloud, barely clinging to life. He was reunited with his mother and brothers, and his entail on the Triarchy directly leads to the Battle of the Gullet. Aegon travels to King's Landing with Rhaenyra when she takes the city. His elder half-brother and now heir to the throne, Joffrey Valerian, arrives shortly after, along with his dragon Tyraxus. Because he's second in line to the throne after Joff, Aegon becomes known as Aegon the Younger, to distinguish him from Aegon the Elder, aka Aegon II. Aemon conceived the child with Alice when they abandoned Harrenhal, and though he dies, Alice survives and continues to hold the castle for at least a couple years after the dance. Her child is technically his heir, and the only reason its legitimacy will be questioned is because no one saw Aemon marrying Alice, which she insists he did. While we know what happens to Daemon's heirs, and we'll get to that in a few minutes, we don't know what happened to Alice's baby just yet. Hopefully we'll get that answer when Martin releases Blood and Fire and pencils in the second half of the Targaryens' rule over Westeros. But with Harrenhal and the matter of the strongest dragon resolved, all that remained was dealing with the last Hightower army, and that fell apart for reasons we've already mentioned. Hugh and Ulf betrayed the Blacks at First Tumbleton, joined the Greens, and were given or promised castles in exchange for their loyalty and their firepower. But these castles would no longer satisfy their overinflated tastes. Ulf was given Bitterbridge, but he desired Highgarden, and Hugh desired becoming king himself. Despite being only known as a claimant in the realm after Aemon's death and Aegon's disappearance, Daemon couldn't help but allow Hugh and Ulf's claims to fester, seeing as he was at a clear 2-against-1 disadvantage. Yes, the Hightower army that held Tumbleton still had thousands of men, but Hugh and Ulf's dragons were much larger than Tessarion, so Darren couldn't just burn them out like he did Bitterbridge. Instead, he was forced to take a more cloak and dagger approach, as he joined a conspiracy to poison the pretender dragonlords instead. After Ormond's death, command of Hightower forces fell to Hobart Hightower, Ormond's uncle, but this still isn't the same Hobart from the show. Show Hobart is Otto's older brother and the man who pushed him to become hand and place their bloodline upon the Iron Throne. Book Hobart is an ineffectual leader at best, and his finest act is organizing the Caltrops to kill Hugh and Ulf. This was a group of high lords and commanders that conspired to poison the Dragon Riders, and it included guys like Bold John Roxton, Ormond's silent giant killer from the show, and Lord Unwin Peake, who becomes extremely important in the aftermath of the dance. After getting their prince's express permission to go ahead with their plot, the Caltrops successfully poisoned their targets, with Hobart even going so far as to drink poisoned wine with one of them. But just then, tragedy strikes, or rather, fate intervenes. When Corlys Valerian was ordered to detain his son, he warned him to flee instead and was thrown into black cells by Luther Largent, who lived much longer in the books. This causes the Valerian men augmenting King's Landing's forces to desert the city and go back to Driftmark, where Alan was already hard at work rebuilding his family's fleet. Adam, determined to prove that not all bastards need to be stains on their families, decides to do something bold instead of running away. He goes to the Isle of Faces, takes counsel from the legendary Green Man, and then pieces together an army by flying to those river houses that can still pledge men to the cause. This is when House Tully properly joins the war, because Lord Grover dies and his son Elmo is a staunch supporter of the Blacks. In the show, Oscar Tully is part of the war effort from the start, but in the books he only becomes renowned after his dad joins the fight, and he isn't even the best Muppet Tully of the lot. That would be his older brother Kermit, who succeeds Elmo as Lord of Riverrun when he dies on the march. This Second River army meets up with the remnants of First Tumbleton, which includes Benjicott and Alysanne Blackwood, and also consists of Sabbatha Frey, who's also related to the only heroic Frey in history, the Black supporter Forrest Frey. In the show, Sabitha is more of a savvy politician who takes a seat in Rhaenyra's small council, but only because she wasn't given Harrenhal like Jace promised. But in the books, Sabitha fights on the front lines and is rumored to be involved with Alysanne as well, seeing as they share tents. These two women fought at Second Tumbleton, being led into battle by Adam and Seasmoke, not knowing just how lucky they all were. Second Tumbleton pretty much coincided with the Caltrops assassination plan in timing, and its surprise nature neutralized all three of the Green's remaining Dragon Riders. Ulf was taken care of by Hobart, Bold John killed Hugh just as the battle began, and Darren became an unfortunate casualty when his tent was set on fire, or he was killed by one of the Blacks, or both, or neither. The circumstances of Darren's death are so mysterious that for years after the dance, pretenders kept coming forward claiming to be him, because his body was never found. Yet, while Tessarion, Vermithor, and Silverwing didn't have riders, they were still dragons, and smelling so much death around themselves they couldn't resist joining the fray. Tessarion and Seasmoke ended up performing some sort of elaborate mating ritual according to the Maesters, instead of properly fighting each other, and this is backed up by the fact that observers saw the Blue Queen attacking Vermithor alongside Adam and Seasmoke. But while Silverwing stayed out of the fight, the Bronze Fury alone was more than enough to deal with two dragons, and that's exactly what he does. Vermithor, Tessarion, and Seasmoke die fighting each other, with Tessarion needing to be mercy killed by Benjicott Blackwood's archers. Silverwing ends up flying deeper into the Reach, establishing a lair near the Red Lake, and Vermithor and Tessarion's skulls become tourist attractions at Tumbleton for a while, helping pay for the reconstruction of the city they laid waste to. The Black Army, having won the day, then turns its attention northward, because even after all these battles and victories, the war still isn't done. The Blacks might have won every major military engagement and individual duel, yet they were brought down to their knees by shadow war within King's Landing and their own queen's incompetency. In the half year that she quote-unquote ruled, Rhaenyra raised taxes on the small folk of King's Landing to such a degree that they became openly hostile to her rule. She didn't even have the brilliant idea of pinning it all on a hastily named master of coin. While this was going on, she also alienated her allies through her paranoia and rejected peace proposals left, right, and center. If Rhaenyra didn't agree with Corlys's plan to sue for peace, there was no way she would agree with Alicent's plea to divide the Seven Kingdoms into 2 seats for herself and Aegon, and she didn't. Instead, Rhaenyra indirectly caused the death of Alicent's only daughter, because the end of her occupation of King's Landing was spurred on by Helena's demise. This, in turn, was motivated by 3 factors: the populace's mistrust of the administration, the presence of a mad preacher called the Shepherd who declared all Targaryens and their dragons abominations to willing ears, and Larys Strong, who was organizing the sabotage of her reign from within the capital itself. Right before Second Tumbleton, 2 of Corlys Valerian's sworn swords tried breaking him out of the Black Cells and were hanged for their efforts. It says a lot about you as a ruler when the populace hates you for keeping the guy who shipped blockaded supplies for months, and Rhaenyra's nightmare was just beginning. That same night, Helena was found impaled upon the spikes within the moat that surrounds Maegor's Holdfast, and whether she took her own life or was killed remains hotly debated. Some blame Helena's madness for her death. Some blame Miseria, claiming she tortured her psychologically by telling her about Maelor's excruciating end, and others say that Helena was pushed into the moat by Luther Largent, Rhaenyra's personal attack dog. That last claim was disproven because Largent wasn't even in the Red Keep that night. But the fact that the mob that started rioting in King's Landing used Luthor's alleged presence as part of the ignition spark tells you that Larys Strong was egging things on from the shadows. The rioting mob also claims to be seeking justice for Helena, Jaehaerys, and Maelor, who are interestingly the only confirmed deaths from the main Green Line at this point. When her city starts tearing itself apart for all the reasons we just mentioned, Rhaenyra's instinct is to hunker down in the Red Keep, and to be fair, she's not wrong. Maegor's Holdfast is a castle within a castle. The keep is the safest place for her and her family. But teenage boys care about being bold more than being safe, and in the end, boldness is what takes the life of the last son Rhaenyra had from her first parenting relationship. Her son Joffrey, who's much older in the books, begs her to let him fly Tyraxis and disperse the mob, to show her he can be as brave as his dead brothers, but she flat out refuses. Joff, being a teenager, decides he's not going to listen to his mom and hijacks a Cyrax for a joyride to the Dragon Pit. Cyrax is the only dragon that was kept at the Red Keep instead of the Dragon Pit, and despite his young age, Joffrey at least knew that he would fight best with his own mount underneath him. Sadly, the kid didn't know that riding a dragon that he hasn't bonded with would earn him a death fall, and that's exactly what happens. Cyrax shrugs off Joff, and he plummets to his death. And even the 7 knights that ride through King's Landing on Rhaenyra's orders to save his life can only bring her his remains. Fun fact, but one of these 7 saviors was Glendon Good, who was among the youngest and shortest serving Lord Commanders of the White Swords. He was Lord Commander pretty much from when the riot began to when he died trying to stop it, and he wasn't the only one. Laurent Marbrand died the day before Glendon, trying to control Flea Bottom with a mere 100 knights. And even Torrin Manderley, who's more of a knight in the books, gets in on the action, with his White Harbor Knights holding the hook from the rabble. Despite getting her son's bones back, Rhaenyra knows the city's lost the moment she hears an eruption from the Dragon Pit, because the riot unfolded in 2 major locations. Most of King's Landing was the first location, and the second was the Dragon Pit, where the Shepherd and his fanatical followers of the Faith of the Seven slaughtered every chained dragon. Helena's Dreamfire, Joffrey's Tyraxus, Jaehaerys' Shrykos, and Jaehaerys Morgul killed scores upon scores of crazed Kingslanders, but in the end were overwhelmed by a sea of steel. Syrax, who arrived at the Dragon Pit after killing Joffrey, died herself, though she put up a fierce fight. Once Rhaenyra realized she lost all her dragons, she fled the capital herself with only her son Aegon and her Queen's Guard at her side, and her father's crown in her hand. She went from Rosby to Stokeworth to Duskendale, and was advised to go to the Vale to Lady Jane and Rhaena to rebuild, but she refused to heed that advice. Having reached peak paranoia, the only place Rhaenyra felt would be safe anymore was Dragonstone, so she sold her crown and bought safe passage for herself and her son to her island seat. When she reached the fortress, she was greeted by Sir Alfred Broome, who she remembered as part of her loyal council at the beginning of the war. What she forgot was that she didn't give Broome the promotion he'd been wanting for ages, and what she didn't know was that's the reason he sided with Aegon when he took Dragonstone. Broome orders all of Rhaenyra's escort to be put to the sword and brings her in front of his new king, where the new iconic exchange takes place. Rhaenyra says, "Dear brother, I'd hoped you were dead." And Aegon the Elder says, "After you, you are the elder." Aegon the Younger is separated from his mom and forced to watch as Rhaenyra is executed for treason by Sunfire and then devoured on the spot. Though Sunfire dies a few days after this himself on account of the injuries he sustained throughout his life, that image of the dying dragon eating his dying mother leaves an irremovable impression on Aegon the Younger's mind, and that impression reshapes Westeros for over a century. Alfred Broome urges Aegon the Elder to kill Aegon the Younger because with Rhaenyra gone, he was now heir to her cause. Killing him would end that cause altogether. But like his half-sister, Aegon didn't want the realm to remember him as a kinslayer. So, like Baela, he had Aegon the Younger kept alive as well, while he himself prepared to reclaim the throne. See, while Rhaenyra was fleeing the capital, all of her loyal prisoners were being led out of their cells. And the men doing the rescuing belonged to Larys Strong, who had come out of his hiding place and took what he clearly saw as his rightful position in the world. A large reason that the riots at King's Landing got as out of hand as they did is because a hedge knight named Sir Perkin the Flea raises up dozens upon dozens of gutter knights to preserve a bastard's rights. Casting Rhaenyra down wasn't going to be enough. Someone else would need to take her place, and according to Sir Perkin, that someone should be Trystane Truefire, an alleged bastard son of King Viserys. Perkin and his gutter rats are the ones who take over the Red Keep and free people like Alicent, Corlys, and Tyland, the last of whom had been tortured to within an inch of his life in an attempt to get him to divulge the location of the crown's gold. They also Larys walk into the throne room and personally declare Trystane Truefire the new king, which means that Perkin the Flea and Trystane were his creations. It looks like he'd hoped both monarchs would die before he made this proclamation, but clearly that turned out to not be the case. While Larys raised up Trystane, the Street of Silk proclaimed its own king in Gaemon Palehair, a boy who was known to be Aegon the Elder's bastard. Fathered on a whore, Gaemon's claim was weak, but stronger than Trystane's because the people knew about it. And we suspect that's part of the reason we kinda saw him in House of the Dragon when Eric and Eric visited the rat pit Aegon loves suck. And on Visenya's Hill, the shepherd preached the glory of the Seven, and the joy of having averted a doom like Valyria from the bones of the dragon pit. Amidst the skulls of the dragons his words slew. These 3 kings on 3 hills of King's Landing competed with one another for control of the city, while conflicting edicts for about a month, which is when the Baratheon army finally made its proper appearance. Lord Boros' 6,000 men had defeated the Vulture King and were now riding to protect the rights of the king that they declared for, and the princess they harbored. After Boros' men took control of the capital, Aegon sailed from Dragonstone for King's Landing on the personal ship of Alan and Adam Valyrian's mother, with the new scion of House Valyrian traveling beside him, because, in amongst all this commotion, a deal had been made. Larys Strong and Alicent Hightower brought Corlys Valyrian to their side and named him their new master of ships in exchange for getting him to end the war, which at this point, Corlys was all too eager to do. But he wasn't going to do it without certain assurances. And like he tells Fleet Gang, his knees are old and stiff and do not bend easily. He wanted full pardons for all parties that fought in the war, on both sides, and an immediate release of his granddaughter Baela and the betrothal of Aegon the Younger to Princess Jaehaera, so they could be named Aegon the Elder's joint heirs. Alicent balked at the audacity of this proposal, but Larys Strong convinced her to agree, and so Corlys flipped from the blacks to the greens. But he soon came to realize that the cost of his pride and ambition is everything, because as soon as Aegon arrived in the capital, he started disagreeing with Corlys on pretty much everything. The show makes it clear that he can't procreate anymore, but in the books that's not as clear. So when Aegon takes up the marriage pact with House Baratheon in Aemon's stead, it still makes sense considering the king's royal pecker has an absolutely, totally 100% burst open like a sausage. Aegon II holds the Iron Throne for nearly half a year as Second Templeton is fought towards the end of his reoccupation. In that time, he commissions massive statues of Aemon and Daeron and makes every effort possible to deny favoring the best possible course for the future. He starts by punishing the 3 pretenders of the 3 hills. Daemon Palehair is spared harsh treatment on account of his being a bastard, but his supporters are all hanged. Trystane Truefire's coronation and reign as king is cut dramatically short by Aegon, who gives him a final boon of knighthood before executing both him and Sir Perkin the Fleet. The Shepherd gets the worst of the lot, as he and his followers are burnt to death by the king, and that's just the beginning of his retribution. Aegon the Elder has several black loyalists brought to court, swear fealty to him, and give him golden hostages, both of which harden the realm against him. He flip-flops between letting Aegon the Younger and Baela Targaryen live or die, with Aegon the Younger in particular being the target of his wrath. Many at court wanted the boy dead, including the tortured Tywin Lannister, and the Sea Snake was the only reason Rhaenyra's oldest surviving son didn't perish. When Corlys Velaryon pressed the matter of his marriage to Jaehaera, Aegon the Elder declared that he'd only keep his nephew alive as long as he wasn't a threat to his succession. Aegon would have made the boy a eunuch or had him take the black, and that's when things were going well for him. When the Black Army that won at Tumbleton made its march towards King's Landing, it wasn't the only force to do so. Rhaenyra's death had turned her allies into angry wasps, and they were all converging on their target in waves. A large detachment of soldiers departed the Vale at around the same time the Second River Army closed in on King's Landing, and Cregan Stark's proper northern army was but a few days' march away. Lord Boros Baratheon rallied his men and set out to meet the Rivermen in battle, but was defeated rather humiliatingly at the Battle of the King's Road. When word reached the capital, Corlys urged Aegon the Elder to abdicate, take the black, and raise up Aegon the Younger as the new king. Instead, Aegon the Elder told Corlys to cut off Aegon the Younger's ear and send it to the River Army as a warning on his mother's advice. Alicent Hightower isn't nearly as stupid as she is in the show, after all. She's as much of an architect of the Hightower plot as her father was, and when all her children and grandchildren are taken from her, she becomes a bitter, vengeful wraith of a woman. Like her son, she wants Rhaenyra's line to end, but unlike her son, she no longer has any major political power, hence the ear bending. After realizing that neither the king nor his mother would cooperate with peace any longer, Corlys Velaryon performs the most shameful act of his life. He poisoned the man he swore to serve. With the help of Larys Strong, Corlys has Aegon's favorite flagon of wine spiked, and when the king dies, he takes Aegon the Younger to the gates of King's Landing and yields the city to Kermit Tully and his lads and ladies. This marks the end of the Civil War's many conflicts and battles, because after the Battle of the King's Road, the Greens have no allies or armies left. They can no longer be a major military threat, and the only person who could take up their cause was of dubious parentage at best. What do we mean by that? Well, just because the swords stop clashing with one another doesn't mean the war itself is over. And to end a war like this, you don't need a lad like Kermit Tully. You need a man like Cregan Stark. The Hour of the Wolf, and the new era of Targaryen rule. When the lads survived at King's Landing, the city entered a strangely jovial mood. The war was over, or at least the fighting was done, and the people could finally rebuild and restore themselves in earnest. People were celebrating and partying all over the city, and this rager continued for a few days, until Cregan Stark arrived. Kermit and Oscar Tully, as well as Benjicott Blackwood, were extremely young men who were also prodigious at warfare, but they were children nonetheless. In the presence of a hard, northern man like Cregan, their heads bowed like cowering wolf pups, and the entire city was on edge once more. The Rivermen and the Valemen would have liked nothing more than to call the war and go back home, but Cregan was determined to fight on until every last piece of resistance to Aegon the Younger's claim was removed. He spent 5 days occupying the capital, drawing up plans to capture Old Town, Castle Rock, and Storm's End, and negotiated terms with all sorts of lords, ladies, and commoners. The only reason he didn't strike out immediately after reaching the capital was because Corlys Velaryon had already made overtures to the Hightowers, Lannisters, and Baratheons, and his peace terms were in the process of being evaluated. Cregan didn't want to break that opportunity, but he expected the terms had not be accepted and prepared for all possible contingencies. His other major focus during the occupation of the capital became delivering justice to the prisoners of Aegon II, because he might have fought for the other side, but he was a king nonetheless, and regicide was a crime that deserved capital punishment. 22 men were arrested as part of the conspiracy, including Corlys, Larys, and a member of Aegon's Kingsguard. And on the 6th day of his occupation, Cregan Stark delivered justice to the shades of the fallen monarchs. He intimidated the new boy king into naming him Hand, and delivered swift yet just sentences to the men who betrayed their king. 19 of them were allowed to take the black and join the Night's Watch. The Kingsguard member and Lair Strong opted for execution, which Cregan performed himself with ice. Corlys Velaryon was the only man spared, and he wasn't spared because Cregan liked him, but because too many people spoke up in his defense. His granddaughters Baela and Rhaena, both of whom had arrived in the capital, convinced Aegon the Younger to convince Cregan to show leniency to Corlys and restore him to the small council. Black Aly Blackwood promised to marry Cregan to ensure this edict, and Corlys' future loyalties were ensured. And being satisfied with the peace proposal's acceptance and dispensing justice, Cregan Stark wrapped up the Hour of the Wolf on the 6th day and marched back home with his new bride on the 7th. Several members of his Great Northern Army were old men who didn't expect to survive the war, and when Cregan marched him, these men remained in the south. Sabba the Frey and Aly organized widow fairs in the Riverlands after the war to match these Northmen with women who'd lost their husbands, and the fairs were a resounding success by all metrics. A couple of new sellsword companies were created by all those Northerners still itching for a fight, and that was pretty much that. Jaehaera was betrothed to Aegon the Younger officially right after his death in the Hour of the Wolf, and their marriage took place shortly after Cregan's departure. It was attended by every remaining member of House Targaryen and House Velaryon, with Baela, Rhaena, and Alan becoming Aegon the Younger's staunchest supporters thereafter. The boy was officially crowned King Aegon III, and with his coronation and marriage, the two warring branches of House Targaryen were finally reconciled. In the end, we can't really say that Rhaenyra or Aegon won the Dance of the Dragons, because they died and their children were practically forced to forge peace. While Alicent Hightower did witness everything we've just mentioned, she never brought herself back into the king's peace, and once even encouraged Jaehaera to slit her new husband's throat in his sleep. She would be confined and isolated after that incident, driven insane by loss and grief, and she'd die hating the color green. Alan became the new Lord of the Tides as his father took his place by the new king's side, for the king was too young and his regency would be too long. Aegon III was 11 years old when he became king, and for the next 5 years, Westeros would be ruled by a council of regents, which he himself frequently clashed with. Corlys stabilizes things for a few weeks after the dance, but then he too perishes because of a fall, a chill, and old age at 79. He's given the full honor guard plus traditional burial by Alan, and it's said that the violent wild dragon cannibal flew overhead as Corlys' body sank into the depths, saluting the sea snake. The Seven Kingdoms still had many problems to contend with, like the Greyjoy Lannister War in the west, a new succession crisis in the Vale tied to House Arryn, wildling invaders in the north, and rising Dornish influence in the south. The Reach, the Crownlands, and the Riverlands needed to be rebuilt pretty much from scratch, and the Riverlands in particular were still dangerous because the Witch Queen Alice Rivers was gathering blades at Harrenhal to defend her rights of her quote-unquote son by Aemond. She kills many of Aegon III's representatives with black magic the last time we see her in the books, and removing her from power is presumably a massive undertaking considering her skills and the rumor that she also has a dragon. But for the most part, peace and stability do return to Westeros, as do dragons. Instead of claiming sheep stealing like she does in the show, Rhaena hatches a new dragon called Morning at the end of the dance. Morning's hatching is what convinces most people that the Blacks were the rightful party all along, because Morning is the last living dragon still under Targaryen control. But Morning is also a living reminder of the horror that Aegon III had to witness at Dragonstone when his mother died. And so he loved his half-sisters, but he hated Rhaena's dragon. In fact, Aegon III would never take another dragon, and in his initial years as king, he expressed such fear and disdain for their existence that history came to remember him as Aegon the Dragonbane. Morning might have lived a long life for all we know, but within 2 decades of Aegon taking the throne, the last Targaryen dragon was born and died, and from that point onward, all their dragon eggs turned into stone. Aegon himself would end up making an attempt at hatching them towards the end of his life, but by that point, the damage had already been done. The biggest cost of the Dance of the Dragons wasn't just the lives, it was also the loss of dragons. Because with the massive culling of so many of them during the war, it looks like the magic itself decided enough was enough. The Dance of the Dragons was also the death of the dragons until Daenerys Targaryen resurrected them, and for that reason, and all the others we've listed in this video, it will forever be remembered as the worst civil war in Westerosi history. Even Robert's rebellion wasn't nearly as terrible or world-changing as the dance was, and we haven't even touched on all the changes the show has made to this story. We might do that in a separate video, but for today, that's all we've got for you guys. This is the entire story of the dance and the House of the Dragon, and we appreciate you sticking with us for as long as you have. Let us know your thoughts in the comments below, and don't forget to like, share, subscribe to our channel, and ring that notification bell for more dragon content this summer. We'll see you guys real soon with yet another video. So until then, stay safe, have a great day, and we'll see you in our next marvelous video. Stay marvelous.